Thank you very much indeed, Madam Vice President. You covered a lot of ground, and in fact, I think a lot of the issues you raised in your remarks illustrate the state and the history of U.S.-Venezuela relations. So let me go straight to it. I mean, you mentioned the cost of hegemony, you talked about the economic warfare, the collective punishment that is inflicted on people. The true cause of conflict, you say, is the global geopolitical dominance of certain usual powers and the weapons, the instruments they use. The US imposed sweeping sanctions, as we have said, on Venezuela, which was already facing a very dire economic situation in 2019. And as often is the case with unilateral US sanctions, they inflict a huge price on ordinary people. They make life harder for them, but they very rarely, if ever, achieve their objective, at least Washington's objective, namely regime change. In fact, as we speak, the United States, as I mentioned, recognizes Juan Guaido as the interim president of your country. So my question is simple. How do you feel today about Washington knocking at your door because of the surging oil prices? And where will this lead?
Gracias, Guida.
Thank you very much. As I said in my intervention, these unilateral coercive measures that have been declared by the UN as illegitimate and have been declared as a clear violation of human rights of the Venezuelan people, well, they have a small sprint. Every sanction issued by the U.S. administration set forth that these sanctions could be lifted and eased if there is a regime change in Venezuela. That's the doctrine of regime change imposed on countries that refuse to submit, those who are not aligned with a single way of thinking in the world. Therefore, they use economy as an instrument, and they affect the economy of the people through these measures. And this is a collective punishment for the peoples. You said that recently they have knocked on our doors, and I say very humbly, the government of President Maduro, in the worst of conditions in 2019, in 2020, well, the Venezuelan income plummeted from $55 billion to $740 million in 2020. In the worst possible circumstances, President Nicolás Maduro called for dialogue with the United States, a respectful dialogue without impositions. Therefore, if you ask me how do I feel, well, I feel happy that we've been on the right side of history to stick to international law, to international public law, to know that there is no other path. And this is an example for the current conflict. The only path is dialogue, because a different path than dialogue, negotiation, international law will lead to suffering for the peoples. Therefore, humbly, I can tell you that I think the law should impose, diplomacy should impose in the framework of this specialized forum.
Do you have preconditions, though, for resuming normal diplomatic, economic, political relations with Washington? Is it the lifting of sanctions? Is it the de-recognition of Juan Guaido as president? Is the U.S., do you believe, genuinely ready to turn the page and start afresh with Venezuela? And just how far are you willing to go? Because Russia is one of your closest allies. How far are you going to go in normalizing relations with Washington without upsetting Moscow?
Well, you should pose those questions to the United States government. However, as we are concerned, we understand that initial approach cannot be conditioned. Of course not. And these initial contacts started with the framework of the bilateral relations. So this is just the beginning. Let's see if in the framework of diplomacy and constructive dialogue we can move forward.
Your oil sector has been under punishing sanctions, as we say, since 2015. Now, of course, the U.S. is trying to stabilize energy, the price of oil on the world's energy prices. In fact, it is trying to get OPEC members, including some of its closest allies within OPEC, to up their production. That isn't clear that it is going to happen. For now, is Venezuela going to stick with the position of OPEC, or will you try to go a little further to, shall we say, please Washington at this stage?
Well, we need a little bit of history, right, to go back. In 2015, Barack Obama used oil as a geopolitical tool. Venezuela was a precursor of the OPEC Plus agreement. We started with the intra-OPEC, and then we called the large extra-OPEC producers. And in 2016, December, it led to the OPEC Plus agreement. Venezuela is a fervent believer and defender of international agreements. Venezuela has been affected because of these unilateral coercive measures and illegitimate blockade against our country. This has seriously affected our production. Without blockade, Venezuela would have a higher production. So we are willing to remain within the framework of OPEC, of course.
When you look at the way the Ukraine crisis and the war there has been unraveling, President Maduro assured President Putin of, quote, his strong support, even after the Russian offensive began, while much of the world, meanwhile, has been sharply critical of the Russian government, has imposed severe sanctions on Moscow. Just how strong will your support for Moscow remain in the face of all of these mounting pressures?
Our position has been very clear from the outset. From the beginning of the conflict, Venezuela clearly indicated its concern for what happened with this conflict. First, we called for the prevention of the conflict. There were ways to prevent the conflict, deepening diplomacy. President Maduro explained to the Venezuelan people the source of the conflict, and he called for peace. President Maduro called for mediation, effective dialogue between the parties. Various situations have been occurring, as Mr. Wanji said. A lake cannot be frozen in a single day. It doesn't happen. It didn't happen in 24 of February. There have been accumulated aggressions and violations that could have been avoided. For instance, when the United States invaded Iraq, 10,000 kilometers from its border, they did because they thought there was a threat to its security. So they obviated security insurances given by Russia. This could have been avoided and not involved the Ukrainian people in this armed conflict without sacrificing the European peoples, suffering the consequences of the economic warfare. Here in Turkey, I was walking around in the streets in the old city. We went to the Hadrian Gate. People in there, the neighbors, they're worried because it could affect tourism. 20 million Russian tourists come here. Well, you are affecting them. So this should have a diplomatic solution, a negotiated settlement, peaceful. Human beings cannot awaken every morning, read the news to see what are the threats of the parties and not see a reduction, but rather an escalation of the conflict.
Madam Vice President, but the question really on a practical level is this. Venezuela is in a situation right now where it has to hold on to any powerful friend it has, and Russia is one of your, few most powerful friends. You have the opportunity now to normalize relations with the United States. I just wonder, how important does Russia remain for you, for Venezuela, and just how far are you willing to go in withstanding US and Western pressures to isolate Moscow? How far will you go?
Well, this moment requires a lot of maturity of our leaders. We cannot take up international relations from a very infantile approach. Our constitution enshrines the Bolivarian diplomacy of peace with all countries. Venezuela did not withdraw from the United States. The U.S. cut energy links, economic cooperation ties with us, historical relations with our country. We preserve our position. The doors of Venezuela are open for any country wishing respectfully to invest as equals as stated by the UN Charter, and above all, respect the principle of self-determination of the peoples, in this case, the right of the Venezuelan people to self-determination.
NATO expansion, because you did touch on this in your remarks, looking at the big picture of what's going on right now over Ukraine, we hear it as the sovereign right of countries to enter into security arrangements with whomever they please. We also know that the Monroe Doctrine lives on 200 years later. So my question is hypothetical. How would Venezuela respond to a request by Russia to open a base, to station missiles in Venezuela?
Well, let me answer with my constitution, the Venezuelan constitution. In our constitution, we cannot have foreign military bases. This is very simple. Our constitution forbids the installation of a foreign base, a military base in our country.
So that makes it easy for you.
Estuvo fácil, ¿verdad?
That makes it easier.
Extremely easy, madam.
As you know, some of Venezuela's rivals in the region, obviously Colombia, which is one of the closest allies of the United States, has been quite critical of the dialogue you have opened with Washington. And there have been several high-profile US lawmakers as well being quite vocal. In fact, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee says these talks, quote, breathe new life into Maduro's reign of terror. So there's a lot of animosity in some quarters. How do you respond to that?
Well, Colombia is a case that needs to be studied with a lot of caution. Decades of war led to Colombia to be the country with the highest number of displaced people in the world. Venezuela, a neighboring nation with Colombia, for decades, we have received more than 6 million Colombian migrants. That's the truth. It's not the version of the factual media powers. Colombia today is the main producer of cocaine in the world, as established by the UN reports. And Venezuela has had to confront endemic problems that we have in a wide common border. To have to address Colombian paramilitarism, irregular groups. We have confronted drug trafficking groups, and we have not found with Duque someone responsible with whom address this issue that matter to Venezuela and Colombia, but also the international community, because these are international crimes. Mr. Duque, who will leave power very soon, because in May there will be presidential elections. Well, his position has been total irrationality, a profound hatred against Venezuela and its people, of total intolerance. And this has affected his population. When you see the electoral campaign in Colombia, there is not a single presidential candidate that does not offer the reestablishment of economic, political relations with Venezuela. That's a clamor in Colombia. So Duque's position is a bellicose position, totally baseless, based in our history. The independence of Colombia is due to Colombia, someone who was born in Venezuela, the concept of the greater Colombia, the greater homeland. This has been a betrayal to our historical origin, and there has been a very bellicose position, and Venezuela has never responded but by defending its sovereignty.
Briefly, how do you view these statements coming out of the US Congress?
About?
As I said earlier, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee saying that these talks between you and Washington breathe new life into what he called a government of terror. How do you change those perceptions? Does it matter?
Yo pienso que la humanidad.
Well, I think that humanity, not only Venezuela, humanity every day has been always oppressed by these opinions of factual powers and hegemons of financial capital invested in the media, the military power expressed through the media. Well, we need to value what terror and terrorism means, especially those people who have suffered from terror. Venezuela is a democratic nation. You said that you want to come to Venezuela. You are more than welcome. One of the things Venezuela has been much more criticized since Chavez was elected was its commitment with participatory democracy. Venezuelan people should decide its future and have a direct exercise in public affairs. So those comments, really, they do not contribute, they do not favor the establishment of true, respectful relations between the two nations.
As you know, these comments and those perceptions about the lack of respect for human rights in Venezuela is what leads to unilateral sanctions being imposed. You called it a blockade against Venezuela. You gave the example of Cuba, a 60-year-old embargo that remains in place. How do you change this reality? How do you reform the United Nations system? We are talking about the future of multilateralism. The UN, when it began in 1945, had 51 countries. Today there are 193 member states. Yet the US and the West in general, as you say, play a predominant role in the organization. The developing world, I think it's fair to say, lags quite a bit behind. In fact, the non-aligned movement, the G77, is nowhere to be seen. How do you fix this?
Recently, Venezuela, together with other countries, we created the Group of Friends of the UN Charter. Because, as I said in my introduction, every day there's more multilateralism, less multilateralism, and more unilateralism. The imposition of UCM contrary to international law. Therefore, this is part of our existence, the continuous defense of law. Because without law, it will be, it is the law of the strongest? No, it should be the law of reason, of justice, of law that should impose, and not the law of the forest, of the wilderness.
Let me ask you finally, before we wrap up, about your own continent. Latin America, the Caribbean region, has so much potential, so many untapped resources. Yes, yet it is a continent that isn't seemingly really taking off. There are structural imbalances, you have racial divisions, you have a lack of regional unity as well. What is holding back this region, which remains so divided within societies and among countries? What is the way forward as you see it?
Well, Latin America has a huge challenge ahead. It has to understand how Latin America could be a great region if it is united. The United States understood this from the outset. Therefore, they approved the Monroe Doctrine to dominate the continent, because they knew the force, the strength of Latin America and Caribbean united. I gave an example recently in the framework of the pandemic. The International Monetary Fund approved some special draft rights. Well, those monies are being concentrated in the West. They allocated, however, an amount for Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, if you see all the deposits, the resources, financial resources of Latin America in the West, you will realize that it's 5 times higher than those special rights approved by the IMF to tackle COVID in the region. If unity, as Bolivar conceived it, unity to grow together, unity to answer together, to respond to, if we were truly mindful of this unity, and Commander Chavez said this when he founded CELAC, UNASUR, and ALBA, the need to have unity in the region to respond to powers with hegemonic positions. My concrete reply is the following. We need to pursue unity. Understand that it's the only path we have in the region to overcome together the problems we have instead of surrender to other regions that do not benefit the well-being of our peoples in the region, Latin America and the Caribbean.
Vice President, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for taking my questions and answering them with so much clarity and candor. Delcy Rodríguez, all our best wishes to you and the people of Venezuela. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Vida.